Knowledge that we're on Treaty 4 land and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. I'm here today to talk to you about Following Their Voices, which is an initiative that I've been involved in and engaged in for about 4.5, almost 5 years of my life. Hi Jen, how are you? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the theory, so where this sort of the genesis of Following Their Voices, and about implementation, so where we stand right now and some of the processes and practices that we have within the construct of this work. All right, so where did Following Their Voices come from? There was a window in time that started around 2011 to about 2013 where there were a number of things that were happening in education. A number of studies, and some fairly significant big changes that were occurring at that point in time that led to us moving in this direction. One of the first things that was happening was the ministry, along with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, or what was called Saskatchewan Indian Nation at that time. They both came together and they started a study, a large consultation process that was called the Joint Task Force on improving education and employment outcomes for Indigenous students, or for Indigenous and Métis people. So that study was underway. It was a large consultation that occurred over a number of months. And with that paper, in about 2014, they released several recommendations to the education sector. At that point in time, there was also, within the ministry, we started studying and looking for examples of large-scale initiatives that were demonstrating improved outcomes for Indigenous students. And it's a very difficult thing to find if you do an environmental scan where you can see a very big project that impacts large proportions or large populations of Indigenous students that have really positive outcomes. And one of the pieces of work that was demonstrating strong outcomes was the Teko Taitanga project in New Zealand. And in fact, Teko Taitanga was cited in the Joint Task Force as a promising practice, something to study and take a look at. So, as this was happening, the University of Regina and Dr. Steeves had done a bit of a tour over to New Zealand and met with the people that work in Teko Taitanga, in particular the Mitty Berryman and Russell Bishop, who were the sort of architects of that work. And he asked for a bit of an exchange. So Mitty Berryman, along with a colleague of hers, T&MSeminarNov8, Barrett, came to Canada. And in coming to Canada, I made a deal with Larry that Mitty and T&MSeminarNov8 would come to the ministry to talk to us about the work they were doing and do a bit of a presentation and start a dialogue. So a dialogue started at that point in time, and there was an invite that was made by Dr. Berryman to see if we would like to go and visit New Zealand and see the initiative in action. All right, let's see if this works here. Does it work? Am I pressing the wrong buttons? I am. And I've done it again. All right, here we go. Does it work? No? Help?
Okay.
There we go. I can do it. I've got it. Thank you. So, at the same time, there was a change in the Deputy Minister's office in the Ministry of Education. A gentleman named Dan Florzone came in, and he was from Health. He came in, and one of the things he implemented was a broad-based engagement process to create a sector plan, a plan that included input from almost all sector partners. So this work, the Education Sector Strategic Plan, started in about 2013, 2014. When Dan came in, he also undertook a consultation process called Student First. And Student First basically was an engagement process with students and families all across the province. Went from basically the top of the province to the bottom of the province, and it took place over about a 6-month period of time. And in essence, in Student First, the questions that were asked by the two folks that led the consultation process was, what do you need in order to be successful in school? Okay, so we have Student First occurring. We also have a new sector plan, broad-based plan to determine and try to narrow our focus and get to some outcomes. And the Government of Saskatchewan released the Plan for Growth. And the plan for growth set some fairly audacious targets in education. One of them, and probably most importantly in there, was the target to reduce the educational disparity between non-Indigenous and Indigenous students. So that was a target that was supposed to be hit by 2020, okay? And at that point in time, the difference in graduation rates for Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students was over 40%. So big, 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 huge target, okay? So we have this happening. A group of folks from Saskatchewan went to New Zealand, and when we went to New Zealand, we saw this incredible program that basically had reduced the gap or the disparity in educational outcomes for Maori students and non-Maori students in the schools that it was being implemented in. There are about 44,000 students that were in Te Kotaitanga schools, and what they were seeing over the course of 13 years was that this disparity was reduced and almost disappeared. So something really successful. And one of the key components to that work was research that was done in around 1999-2000. What they did in 1999-2000 was went out to students, their families, teachers and administrators, and they asked them the same kind of question that was asked in Student First. What do you need in order to be successful in school? So, a contingent of folks that went overseas came back, and we decided that we would undertake the same research. And we would do it in consultation with the folks from New Zealand. So you can see the research that we did had three components. One, seeking their voices. Two, hearing their voices. And finally, three, following their voices. So we undertook this research, and I'll tell you a little tiny bit about the research. So what we decided to do was we would study, we do this study in 6 different schools across the province. Some schools on reserve, some schools provincial, okay? We also wanted to ensure that we had what they called, quote-unquote, engaged students and disengaged students. We also wanted to hear from their parents, their families, teachers, and administrators. And we wanted to ask them very similar questions. What do we need in order to be successful with Indigenous students? Okay? So the research started. And there were several focus conversations that were held across the province in these schools at the same time as the Student First consultation was occurring. Surprisingly, Student First consultation with 8,000 to 10,000 students, our consultation with a lot less. Findings were very, very similar. Okay? So what it does, from my perspective, is confirms what we're hearing within our work is being heard by a very large population of kids across the province. So seeking their voices was underway. The second phase of this work was hearing their voices. And hearing their voices really is the idea of taking a look at the transcription and doing the analysis of transcriptions and trying to find themes. Okay? With the idea that what was found within those voices of those folks would help us set up our theoretical framework for our initiative. Okay? And then, basically, we had this theoretical framework, which then drove us to setting up a job-embedded professional development program that's designed to better meet the needs of our Indigenous students, our First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students, such that we start to address this disparity in our education system. So, I'm going to ask you just to take a minute. You're all taking notes, which is fantastic. I'd like you to write down, take a moment yourself, and write down what you think the biggest challenge is to the achievement of our Métis, Inuit, and First Nations students in the province. What's the biggest challenge that they face in terms of achievement? I see some folks have continued. Your pens are still working, which is great.
How long do we have?
You don't have very much time. So why don't you just tell me, what are you thinking are some of the challenges that our Métis, Inuit, and First Nation students face?
Engagement, I think, is
Engagement,
big.
yeah.
Lack of belonging or identification with schools and teachers.
Okay, lack of belonging, lack of identification with the people that are in the building. Anything else?
I said belonging, relationships.
Okay.
I guess communication is the biggest the challenges, because you should understand the students' need
Yeah.
for understanding.
Okay, great. So communication between folks so that they understand their needs. Outstanding. Anything else? Okay. So surprisingly, those are findings that were within the research in and of itself. I'm going to ask you to do another thing. When the thematic analysis was done, they were able to take these voices from these 5 different groups of folks, really, if you look at the engaged and disengaged students. And they, in essence, were able to categorize what students were saying, what their families were saying, what teachers and administrators were saying, into 3 really big sort of buckets. They said that the biggest impact on student achievement resided either in the student themselves, their background, their home life, okay? Factors that are outside of school. So socioeconomic status, whether they come from a single parent family, how literate their parents are, whether they have a job, that sort of thing, okay? Factors that are outside of school. The second theme was the structure in school. So structure are things like when school starts, how long the classes are, how it's structured, how teachers work, teach, that sort of business. So broadly, that structure of how schools work. And finally, the last one were relationships. Primarily relationships in the classroom. So that's relationships teacher to student to student relationships that were occurring in the classroom. Those were the 3 big buckets that came out of the analysis. So I'm going to ask you right now, if you had 100, okay, if you had 100, and what do you think was most important in the minds of the teachers, the administrators? What did they say was most important? Teachers, administrators, students, and families. So if you're going to bucket, put pieces in a bucket or proportion that 100 across those 3 things, what might that look like for teachers in terms of importance? What's most important?
100 from the teacher perspective?
100 from the teacher perspective, 100 from the student perspective, 100 from the parent perspective. You're proportioning that 100 out across those things. So take a moment, think about that, okay? And the administrator too. So those 4, teacher, student, parent, administrator. We don't have a lot of time, so fortunately I think we got to move on. But what's interesting in those findings is that the value that people put on those 3 things is very different depending on who you are in a building. So let's take a look at things. If I'm an administrator, a principal in a building, oh, look at this. So principals apportion what's going to impact achievement most with structure. Surprisingly, that's what they have the most control and agency over is structure. So the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree there, I would say, is that what they're saying is that 58, if you analyze what they're saying, they're apportioning most of their what's important into that bucket. The next bucket is about relationships in class, and finally the last is what kids bring to school. If I look at teachers, which is the red one, they apportion structure the highest to 2. Second highest is outside factors, and last is relationships in classrooms. If I look at parents, which is the funny green bar on the outside, I'm not even sure what color that is, they apportion the most, again, to structure, second most to relationships, and finally, lastly, outside factors. Whereas students apportion the most value. What's interesting here, that's student A, that's student B. Student A, student B, student A, and student B. So we have engaged and disengaged students there. And what's interesting is they value things, maybe one more than the other, right? But they value things in the same way. So, what's most valuable to students? Right here, pardon me, these are the kids here. These ones right here, sorry. That one is the kids, that one's the kids. So this bucket right here, that says kids value. Student A values relationships. Student B values relationships. Then they value structure, and finally they value factors outside of the school. So what kids are saying is that it doesn't really matter who I am. I come to school, and what's going to impact me most is the relationship between myself and the people in the classroom, most particularly the teacher in the building. Whereas the teachers are saying something completely different. They're saying, not as important here. So what we have is we have this dichotomy. We have people who look at the world very differently. And we know that this is what we currently have. This has resulted with what our results are currently. So, in order for us to better meet the needs, we need to be listening to all the voices of these folks, but we need to be considering really what these kids are saying right here. Okay? So that's the unit analysis that was done. Okay? So from the unit analysis and from this work, the researchers sat together and they started to create this theoretical framework. Okay? So they needed to create, from the voices, they needed to create a vision for what it is that we do within the context of this work. And the vision, I love this thing. I think this is brilliant. So the vision really tells us, and I'm going to do something that people say you should never do. I'm going to read this. So I'm going to do it anyway. I don't care. Our vision is that education that promotes accelerated learning for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students, where learning is joyful, culture is affirmed, and students are given a real choice for their future. So what are the 4 most important things that are part of this vision? 4 most important things.
You're asking us?
Yes, I'm asking you.
Okay, people first.
Okay?
Culture being affirmed.
So affirmation, culture, joy,
Choice.
choice, and there's a really important one. Where's this pointer thing? What did I do? I'm terrible with this thing.
From current slide.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, the last one is that one, accelerated learning. So there's so one, we need to accelerate the learning of our Indigenous students. They need to learn as Indigenous students. That not only, and learning needs to be joyful. Now this was a real struggle for some people. How can learning be joyful? Well, how can it not? It should be. It should be a place where, at its best, learning is hard. It's hard work, but it should be something that really invigorates you. You should come to work every day. I come to work every day and I love my job. I find real joy when things are successful. And students should feel the same way. And then this is what I think is the real lovely gem to this idea of real choice. And unfortunately, folks, like it or lump it, not graduating from high school limits the choices students have. Any study that you look at that talks about long-term outcomes for people that graduate from high school, that go on to post-secondary education, or they never finish high school, demonstrate, just from a purely economic standpoint, that there are different outcomes for those folks. And that students who do not graduate from high school are not given this. Their life is limited. And so the first and most important point is that we give them choice for their future. But even more importantly in that, real choice. And real choice digs deep at what kids were saying, digs deep at what teachers say, digs deep at what principals say, which is we need to create a culture in buildings that allow for students to be highly successful. Not just get through school with 50, but get through school with real credits. Credits that actually mean something, so that when I leave, I actually can open a door and say, I can pick that door, or that door, or that door, or that door. So that's what this says to me. I think it probably says, well, it could say lots to different people. However, for me, there are 4 really important parts to that piece. And people have ripped this apart for the last 3 years. And they ask lots of questions about it, and that's what a vision is supposed to do. You're supposed to start to question and wonder, well, what do you mean by accelerated learning? That's a lovely thing to deconstruct as a staff, or even deconstruct yourself, because that's what schools that are involved in following their voices do. They sit down and they say, so, what do we mean by accelerated learning? Is it dual credits? Is it a better instructional practice, better pedagogy that leads to students being able to move forward? Is it really about using assessment to drive instructional practice? What does that mean? And so that act in and of itself really is the act that we want staffs to engage in. We want people to be very considerate of this work. So, next most important part that came out of the research are what we call the understandings and indicators, or, beautifully said, you and I. Huh, isn't that sweet? Think about that, eh? So one of our researchers actually coined that phrase, you and I, which is stuck, surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, or not surprisingly. So we have a set of understandings, and our set of understandings are these pieces here, these 3 pieces here. Education that is relational and culturally responsive, which is what the framework is built upon, relational and culturally responsive pedagogy. So education that is relational and culturally responsive demonstrates a focus on responding from within areas of influence, a commitment to continuous learning, unlearning, and relearning, and a change in practice that, again, that phrase, accelerated learning, accelerates achievement for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students, learning as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. So these, when people come and participate in following their voices, these are key understandings. These are things that people need to commit to in order to actually truly move the initiative forward. So, responding from within your area of influence. In New Zealand, they talked about 2 things that were coined there and were always talked about. One of their underpinnings was this idea of positively rejecting deficit theorizing.
Definitely.
Okay? And deficit theorizing, you'll find that all over the place now. This idea that oftentimes we get caught in theorizing why students are deficits, instead of looking at the world from a much more, what they termed in New Zealand, which was an agentic stance. A stance where one has agency and control over what it is that happens, and you influence students and their outcomes. So we had this idea that we took this piece of work in the analysis, the hearing their voices, we took this work to a group of elders. We created an elders group that's related, that's linked to FTV now. We have 24 elders. They represent all language groups, all the nations within our province, and we still work with them. So they've been with us for 4 years. We have an annual elders gathering. They're a part of our leadership team, 2 of our elders, and they are a part of every subcommittee that we have. We have 2 elders. One is always Métis, the other one is always First Nation, and almost always one is female and one is male. And they're part of everything we do. They're part of all our decision making. So when we took this framework to them, the wording was different, and we used the word agency here. And so our elders said, we don't like the word agency. It reminds us of an Indian agent.
Yes, it has.
So they said, you got to change that,
History, yeah.
which is fascinating. Never would have thought of that, but again, I'm not an indigenous person. So that's what we came up with this here. The second piece, again, is this idea of the stance one takes when one comes to this work. That one, you have to come with the stance that you're willing to learn. Two, you have to come with the stance that you're willing to relearn and unlearn some things. That really you have to be repositioned in this work to be thinking and understanding the context of our Indigenous students in the classroom. And that is our focus. Unerringly our focus all the time. Our work and the work of following their voices is about Métis, First Nations, and Inuit students. That's our focus. We make no apologies for that. However, when you dig into it, what we do for those students is really good for everybody. It's just good practice. But that's our focus, and it always has been. And we need to do things like, pardon me, we need to do things like start to think and relearn stuff that we probably learned a long time ago and forgot. Especially in teacher education programs. Oftentimes you are in a university, you leave, you begin to teach, and you fall into a way of doing business, right? That you probably is a part of the culture in the building, and sometimes you need to relearn what you probably did learn before and start to implement some of those things that are part of good pedagogy that come out of teacher education programs. You have to unlearn things, because ultimately, folks, our work is really about addressing racism. I make no question about it. It's about addressing racism and prejudice that's within our system. And so that takes a lot of repositioning of somebody and a lot of somebody having to confront how they deal with people that are different than they are. So it's a lot of unlearning that has to occur, and obviously a lot of learning that has to occur too. So that's a strong commitment to this work. Go ahead, Barb.
Tim, did you want questions now or at the end?
Can I wait till the end?
Sure.
'Cause I still got about 20 slides.
Wonderful.
They're going to be short slides. And then, of course, this idea that we need to change our pedagogy and our practice. Okay? So the next piece, the indicators that again came from research, these pieces here, there are 6 of our indicators. These 6 indicators are the lodestone to everything we do. Every last piece of data and every action we take is related in one way, shape, or form to those 6 indicators. Because these 6 indicators are what the people we spoke to said. So they said to us, 1, we need to care for and believe in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students and their cultures. Our elders said we had believing in and caring for. First, they said, well, you can't believe in something unless you care for it, so flip those. Fascinating again. So that's an important indicator. Having high expectations for student success, creating a secure, well-managed learning environment, engaging in teaching and learning interactions that are responsive to student interests and needs, using a range of strategies to promote accelerated growth, and finally using evidence to guide your decisions. 6 indicators, 6 key indicators about the way that we need to do our business. So we talked about those themes and those buckets. There are 3 buckets in here too, 3 themes. The first theme is relationships. Caring and believing in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students is about relationships and building relationships. Having high expectations for student success is about relationships. The second piece is this piece about creating an environment. Okay? An environment that not only reflects the students that we're talking about, but is also safe. It also demonstrates high care for those kids. Okay? And finally, interactions. And interactions are the way in which the dialogue, the back and forth between teachers and students, between teachers and teachers, and between teachers, administrators, and between families. That interaction and that dialogue needs to change. It needs to be focused on being responsive to meet student needs. Practice needs to focus on using strategies that better meet the needs. We need to be addressing both the federal system and the provincial system. You're not going to find anything like this anywhere else in Canada. We don't have something where we have this group of people together in an education sector that actually are all working together to better achievement. So it's unique, it's different, and it's the uniqueness to it and the value of having everybody in is why we've seen some success. So we had a field test. The field test was about testing the tools. It wasn't about getting better outcomes. It was about, does this stuff we're thinking about work? And so it was really about tools and processes. We then started implementation here. And as you know, in implementation, we were building the plane while we were flying the plane. So we started with, in year 1, with a group of schools, again, provincial, First Nation schools, and about 170 teachers that were involved in the initiative. Where are we now? We're right here. We've had another intake of 11 schools this year. And so we have 18 provincial schools, 8 First Nation schools, and 1 joint board of education school. So the school is partially funded by the province and partially funded by the federal government. Okay? We now have over 400 teachers that are involved, and now, if you look at the populations of students in those schools, there's 10,600 students, and the schools have over 6,500 self-declared First Nations, Métis, or Inuit students in. So this is where we are. Where do we want to be? It's a targeted initiative, so we need to be probably in 80 or more schools over the next 5 or 6 years in order to really significantly impact the population of Indigenous students that we have in our province, which means there's lots and lots and lots more work that has to be done. So what is done? And this is the sticky wicket. This is where we are at the business end of the stick. So what I'm going to do here is tell you about the journey that all the brand new T schools here would take in entering the initiative. Okay? So there's a bunch of acronyms on this page, and I'll let you know what the acronyms are. We have the SCLT. That's the Strategic Change Leadership Team. Okay? We also have another one called PLD. Most people call it PD. We call it Professional Learning and Development. And then we have something called the CLC, which is the Critical Learning Cycle. Okay? You'll learn, people will learn these acronyms. They'll become second nature. So, the CLC is this. All right, just so you understand, that's a critical learning cycle. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the journey that a school has to do as they enter FTV and as they move through this. First things first, you need to understand that when a school enters following their voices, they're in, and over time, they're out. We use a gradual release of responsibility model where we provide tremendous upfront supports in terms of professional learning and development and support from people and funding. And over the course of 3 to 5 years, that support and funding winnows away to nothing. And then we're expecting the school, by the time they're done, to be able to implement the initiative and sustain the initiative on their own, so that we can then take that funding and redeploy it to a new school. Because we know there's not a lot of money, and the best way to use the money is to give that tremendous support up front, and then winnow it away over time, and then redeploy that into new schools. So that's our process. And we're still modifying this and making it so that it's much more effective. But quite frankly, the way, I'm just going to go back again. You'll notice here the school numbers stayed the same, but the numbers of teachers changed because we bring new cohorts of teachers on all the time. So you work with a cohort of teachers, and then the next year you continue to work with that first cohort, but then your support goes to the second cohort. Understand? So even when our funding didn't change and their funding didn't change, the number of people involved did. Okay?
So I'm seeing that it went up 50% from year 1 to year 2.
Yep.
So you're typically starting with 10 teachers in your school in the first year, and then added 5 more on the second
We
year.
added 5 more in the second year, and then in year 3 those schools added 10 here. So the only reason we added 5 is because we didn't have lots of money. So money always in any initiative is going to be the biggest determining factor of the rate at which you're able to grow. So So in order to enter the initiative, schools apply, okay? So in the spring of this year, we sent out a call to directors of education, both in provincial and federally funded schools. And we asked them to submit an application to us and get sign off from their director of education. We established to them, we said to them, there's several criteria that we're looking for in our selection process. Most importantly is that you have a high population of First Nations Métis, or a high proportion of First Nations Métis and Inuit students in your school. That you are able to form a strategic change leadership team. And the strategic change leadership team has these folks in it. Number one, it has the administrator in your building that's responsible for doing the work. Number two, it has an in-school facilitator. That's the business end of the stick. That person is the person that provides and works with teachers, their teacher colleagues. We have a lead teacher. The lead teacher has a number of roles. Number one, they participate in all the professional learning and development. Number two, they often act as a guinea pig for the lead teacher. And number three, and this has happened a lot of times, if the facilitator gets sick or can't stay or gets transferred, the lead teacher fills that role. And that's happened more than once in our initiative already, okay? So the last person is a superintendent from your First Nations education organization or your provincial school division. That's your strategic change leadership team. So they had to commit and say that they could form a strategic change leadership team, and they had to identify that they had a willingness with their teachers to do this work. Because if they have no willingness of the teachers to do the work, they might as well not do the work. It's a waste of resources and time. So we had applications. We then made decisions. Our decisions are generally based on our geography, population, on reserve, off reserve. There's a number of factors. And who makes the decision on schools? Our leadership team makes the decision on schools. It's not one person, it's a bunch of folks that make that decision. So first they say, we're in. We select the schools, and then the schools in year one have to commit to 9 days of professional learning and development over the course of the year. So that strategic change leadership team is basically taken out of their school and given just-in-time PD in order to do the work. And so the professional learning and development starts in the spring of the year previous to the implementation. So in late spring, they spend 3 days. We do a retreat. We take everybody away. They have no cell phone coverage. We're literally down in a valley where no one can talk on their phones. And we immerse people for usually 12 to 15, 16 hours a day in understanding the work that they have to do. So it involves repositioning, it involves understanding the tools, it involves understanding the processes, it involves team building, it involves understanding contracts and the work that they're committing to, understanding their roles and responsibilities, how they interact with the rest of the folks that do the initiative. It's highly intensive, lots of work. Okay? 3 days. At the same time, they need to sit down and plan out implementing 5 critical learning cycles over the course of the next year. So we give them a calendar and say to them, here's your cycles. Cycle 1 starts on September 15th and ends on November 7th. Cycle 2 starts on November 8th and ends in January, whatever it is. So we set up 5 cycles. We give them a calendar and say, you have to do this work and have fidelity to doing the work we're asking you to do. And you need to set up times to meet and do certain pieces of work at that time. So they set up their calendar. They talk about the meetings they have to do and go to, and they all get it in their own calendar so there's no excuses. Okay? So that's the first set of PLD that they have to do. They come back in the fall, and that strategic change leadership team then needs to do professional learning and development with their cohort of teachers, the first group of teachers that they're working with. They do it, we do it to them, they then do it to their staff. Train the trainer. They get support from a provincial facilitator that comes, sits down, smiles, helps out when needed. They're generally there for support. Okay? And then they begin the implementation process. Okay? So, over the course of the year, they then come to 6 more days, intensive days of professional learning and development okay, over the course of the school year. And at the end of the school year, we get together and we say, so, how did it go? And let's plan for next year. Okay? That's your first year. In terms of PLD that you're given, okay? The commitment that the school also has to make is that we have provincial facilitators. So right now we have 5 of them. Each provincial facilitator has a responsibility for one of those 27 schools. And their responsibility looks like this. They make a monthly visit to that school, face-to-face visit with the strategic change leadership team. And they ask them 3 really kind of important questions. So what'd you do last month? How did it go? What are you going to do next? Where are you in the critical learning cycle? How's that going? How's your learning? Yada, yada, yada. Okay? Face-to-face meeting. They also have weekly phone calls with the provincial facilitator. So that is usually the strategic change leadership team connects via phone to talk about work. Problem solve, give them resources, do whatever they need to do, make sure they're on track. Okay? So they get supports for that. So what they're getting is a significant amount of support in order to do their work by a provincial facilitator that really understands their business. All our provincial facilitators now have been school-based facilitators, so they know what their job is. Okay? So they are the people that are experts helping people that are learning. Okay? Fascinating, right? So they get all this support, all right, to implement their own professional learning and development, and then the school has to implement in year 1 5 critical learning cycles. Along with those 5 critical learning cycles, they also have to do 3 surveys. The surveys are based on the indicators, and they are given to students, parents, administration, teachers, and they're based on those indicators. That data informs these set of tools. It's used as another assessment of how people are feeling about how we're moving forward. Okay? So, surveys are done. You're implementing this professional learning cycle. So what does the professional learning cycle look like? So you've got 10 teachers. You've got 8 weeks. Those 10 teachers all have to do certain activities over that 8-week period. Week 1 and week 2 is an observation and goal setting. Okay? Observation, feedback, goal setting. So, the school-based facilitator meets with the teacher, says, hey, I would like to come and visit you in your class, and I'm going to be gathering data using this observation tool. I'm going to sit in the back, and I am going to record all your interactions with students and teachers, and I'm going to be recording the engagement of 5, I picked them, 5 First Nations Métis or Inuit students to see if they are, from the outside looking in, engaged or disengaged. So I'm going to watch you for 5 minutes, then I'm going to watch those students for 5 minutes, and I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to do that 5 times in an hour. So I'm going to collect data for about half the time, clean up my data, get it ready, but I'm going to do an observation. Okay, so I do this observation, collect everything you say and do, where you move, who you talk to, what you say to them. It's a fairly significant data collection process. Okay, so you're not only tracking where those kids are, but where the teacher is in relation to those kids, what they say, what the kids say back. Okay, so significant data collection that occurs. So I have this data collection, and then when I'm done, okay, I sit down and have a feedback session with that teacher. So feedback is to look at the data there. Oh, sorry, I'm going to back the bus up. At the end of that lesson, I'm going to go to those 5 kids that I've viewed. I'm going to ask them 2 questions. So, how much work did you get done on a scale? They actually evaluate it. They can move their finger along an iPad to say,